let me say I agree with most of what my colleagues have said so far, and I guess I want to present it in a somewhat different way as a person who has developed and run programs for young children, and particularly children who are at some risk for school failure. In my experience in the public school, one of the things I learned better than anything else, or two things I learned. Number one is I didn't have all the answers because we were still failing, and children were still failing in school. And secondly, that we needed to rethink how we organize programs for young children and be willing to experiment and try new things. And I guess that's my number one message today, is that what I want to do is to talk a little bit about some of the knowledge base that I found useful in thinking about programs and some of the program components that I think we need to consider as we're thinking about the achievement gap and how we can close it. I guess one of the things more than anything else that struck me when I was working in the public schools is how serious it is to fail in school. This is not just a minor bump in the road. Children who do not get through the first 3 years of school in some reasonably good shape are really on a trajectory of failure that is extremely difficult to get off of. And I guess it certainly led me to believe that we need to invest much more in making sure that children are achieving at an acceptable rate during the first 3 years of their schooling. And that means, to me, that we have to pay attention to children from birth until they're 5 or 6 years old. So what I'd like to say is, secondly, that I do believe the Common Core standards are intellectually more interesting than our usual list of small, detailed skills that we've been going with for the last 25 or 30 years. So I really don't have any complaint about the Common Core standards. I think that the standards are challenging, that we will have to figure out some ways to meet them, but that they certainly offer, I think, a closer fit with what we believe in early childhood about what kids ought to learn and be able to do than some of the other more rigid ones did. I guess one of the first things I want to say is that one of the most pressing problems for schools today is the gap in achievement between children from poor families and those from more financially advantaged ones. You know the statistics as well as I do. Children's test scores are low. They're more likely to fail grades and less likely to finish high school. We also have a lot of evidence that we need to start early. We have the Hart and Riesling study that Susan talked about that tells us that there's some specific things that children who are low income are likely not to know. We also have third grade test scores that say if you're not reading in third grade, your trajectory is very hazardous. An admonition, I guess, that the gap in educational achievement of low-income kids is largely the result of public policies we have or don't have that contribute to unemployment, low wages, residential segregation, discriminatory hiring practices, unequal justice systems, low-quality schools, et cetera, and et cetera. As long as those conditions exist, we're going to have poverty, and we have poverty, we're going to have children who have different kinds of experiences, and if they have different kinds of experiences, they are not going to learn the same things that middle-class children learn, and that's just a given. The effects of poverty are diverse and intensive, and they can last a long time and have very little to do with academic achievement. For instance, maternal depression is far more prevalent in low-income communities, and the resources to help avert it are skimpier. And so we're more likely to have infants and toddlers who don't get the kind of responsive care they need. Similarly, health care, and particularly prenatal care, is likely to be skipped over in low-income communities, and as we know, the kinds of diets that are purchased on low-income wages tend to be full of sugars and fats and contribute to obesity and more health problems than before. one of the ones that doesn't get talked about very much is relative poverty. And the American dream, as it's projected on television and in movies and everywhere else, says everybody should have the same things. Everybody should have these $150 gym shoes. It creates a sense in poor communities of diminished expectations, anger, and a real sense that they're not as important in the world as other people are, which is not a good thing for early learning by any stretch of the imagination. So I think one of the things that I'd like to say is that those of us who are in the social services and who are worried about kids and their achievement need to be very careful as we talk to public policy advocates that our quick fixes are going to solve the problem. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to oral language. We need to pay a lot more attention to how we structure play. 100 words or 30,000 words or whatever the new issue is around talking more to your children. These are all wonderful things, but they're not going to solve the problem of poor children. And we need to be very clear with everyone that social services and educational programs can't solve the problem of poverty. However, I think that with well-structured and organized programs that are targeted well, we can help ameliorate some of the disadvantage. Obviously, preschool, being a preschool advocate, is one of the answers and can go a long way toward solving the achievement gap. One of the first things that we have to say is that the achievement gap starts early, and therefore remediating the achievement gap also needs to start early. And the Abecedarian project that started their intervention before the children were 1 year old was far more successful in the educational trajectory of the children than the one that started an intervention at kindergarten. So we do know that the earlier you start the intervention, the less expensive it is and the easier it is to remediate whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. Certainly the research shows that we have, for instance, the research that shows that almost all preschool programs show benefits to children. All the way from High Scope and the Child Parent Centers in Chicago, and Abecedarian, Head Start, all have shown that you can change the educational trajectory with programs. However, they also show that the more sophisticated the program, the easier the change has been to accomplish and the more persuasive and pervasive it has been. There's a great deal of evidence also for the cost-benefit of providing early childhood programs, preschool programs. And Heckman and other economists have shown everything from $7 to $14 to $21 per child for dollars spent in early childhood as paying off in terms of the economic investment of the community. So there's a fair research base that tells us that preschool is an effective strategy for ameliorating some of the achievement gap. There's also a good deal of evidence for using the language as the focus of attention. The development of language is a major developmental step. Children who have broken the code of learning that words convey meaning can then very quickly move ahead to increase their vocabulary and get more complex sentence structure. So it is a very important milestone in children's lives when between 1 and 2 years of age, they break the language code. Once they're primed to learn language, there's no question that they can rapidly increase their knowledge base and their skill base. And finally, they have no other form of communication when they're pre-literate. So it's the only game in town. Oral language is about all little kids have to work with. So what is it about school language and home language that's different? And here's a sort of an example of what might have come out of the Hart and Risley research of the difference between what children might learn at home and what they might learn at school. And clearly, home language, it can be quite different from what is expected at school. However, some kids learn a home language that simply doesn't do them the same amount of good in school as other children's home language. So low-income children are apt to learn a kind of language that is not going to be as helpful to them in school as standard English or the language that other children learn. So there are 2 points I think we need to make about this. Number one, all poor children don't fit that bill. Every poor child does not have the same kinds of characteristics. Indeed, some poor children speak standard English. Some poor children have perfectly good vocabulary. Some poor kids are even very advanced in their language skills. And the second point I want to make is that even if they don't have advanced language skills, or I don't want to call them advanced language skills, call them school language skills. Even if they don't have school language skills, they have wonderful communication abilities. And it's that those communication abilities don't count in how we look at school-related skills and knowledge. For instance, many low-income kids, particularly in the African-American community, they are very able to play rap. When they're 4 and 5 years old, they can rap, they can recite, they can do all kinds of slang. Very frequently comes out of the poor African-American and Latino communities. In African-American communities, there's another game that's called the dozens, where kids learn to play with words. So it is not that they don't have language. It is that they don't have the language needed to be successful in school. And I think it's an important distinction that we need to make quite clear. We're not talking about people who don't have language. We're talking about people who don't have school language. So what causes a school language dysfunction? And I think there are I've listed 4 characteristics that account for it. And the first are the biological. Uh-oh, I didn't do it. It's like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. Anyhow, biological factors include genetics, diseases, accidents, things like dyslexia, cerebral palsy, intrautero accidents, falling on your head. Almost any kind of thing can interfere with the typical development of language abilities. That constitutes, at the preschool level, about 13% of the population. I think it's important to add that by the time they get to be school age, it's only 10%, because many of the children who are conceived of having language difficulty in the preschool indeed make it up before they're 5 or 6 years old. It's an interesting statistic that the number of 2-year-olds that are considered language delayed is much, much higher than the number of 5-year-olds that are considered language delayed, simply because the development of language is not evenly paced for all children over the whole 5 years. The new, or not so new, reason for language difficulties is that what's called environmental stress. We first knew of it in the 1920s and 30s, and it was called hospitalism in those days. But it was the absence of primary caregiving that got in the way of children's development. Now we talk about toxic stress, which is not having caregivers that are sufficiently attuned to the needs of the particularly very young child, or live in environments where violence and unpredictability is so great that it impedes development itself. There are no statistics that I can find on the incidence of toxic stress. However, if you look around the world and the kind of stresses that children live in all over the world and learn to read and write, it's very unlikely that this is a very large proportion of the population. So I'll give it 3 or 4% of children who live in extreme poverty and who also have caregivers who are in many ways unable to buffer that poverty from their children. And it is not a large group of people. and children's. So the more frequent reason why kids don't speak school language is that they have a limited opportunity to learn it. Parents do not sit around and say, I'm not going to teach my child to speak the way they talk in school on purpose. They don't teach their children to talk the way they speak in school because they don't talk that way themselves. There are very few reasons to talk that way. Your neighbors don't talk that way. Your friends don't talk that way. Your community members don't talk that way. So there is very little reason for parents who live in low-income communities to talk differently from the people they talk with. The children learn to talk the way their parents talk. Saying talk more simply means they do more of the same kind of talking. It doesn't help the problem of learning a new language, a new way of using language. It simply means you're encouraging people to talk more. It won't hurt anybody, but it's not going to be particularly helpful. There's a low motivation in many communities to learn to talk in a different way. My best example of that was a young 16-year-old boy who I was berating because he couldn't get a job and he couldn't read. And I was saying, part of the reason you can't get this job, you've got to go back to school and learn to read. And he said, I know lots of people who can't read and who can read, and they don't have jobs either. So the motivation to do things that make you school successful in many communities is just not very great. And finally, there are cultural differences in how people use language. Slade, for instance, talks about children, 5-year-old kindergartners who were asked to tell a story. And the African-American children told stories that were analogical, and the white children were more likely to tell stories that were referential. By analogical, let me give you an example. The black child, if you held up a banana, the black child would be, and the black child was asked to tell the story, they would be more likely to say, it's a banana and my grandmother gave me one and I ate it. Good story for a kindergartner. A white child would be more likely to say, it's a banana and it's yellow and it's a fruit. Both children can do both things. Which would be the most likely and who will be the most successful in school with their most likely response is quite clear. So we have different cultural ways of using language that may interfere or at least be misinterpreted when their children are in school settings. So what should children learn? First of all, they need to learn their home language because it's natural, it's easy, and it's frequently done, and it's the best way to help children break the code, beside the fact it keeps them in good touch with their families and their communities. But secondly, they need to learn the conventions of school speech. Things like inside voices and listen when the teacher talks and no cursing in school. These are just conventions that we arbitrarily set up that everybody doesn't know, and very often we don't even bother to tell children it's not appropriate to do in school. There are uses for speech. Many families don't use a lot of speech to plan or to explain or to estimate or to tell. They use it for some of those things, but not very often. And so children have less experience with it than children who come from families in which these are regular activities. Obviously, as Susan talked about, vocabulary and standard grammar as two other things that are likely to be, that need to be learned in the school setting. The next thing that I think we need to talk about is how should teachers teach? We, in early childhood education, are great. Thank you. I'm going to hire you. I'm trying to get, you're going to, I knew it was going to happen. All right. Developmentally appropriate practices mean methods tied to children's interests and capabilities and designed to help them learn faster and easier. This has been misinterpreted as a bunch of do's and don'ts. Developmentally appropriate practice is a set of principles from which you derive practices. One of the principles is children who play with ideas learn better than children who do not. And that is without question the case. So we can use play to teach, but not all play is equally useful as a teaching tool. And here's a chart that shows the natural use of play, what we would call free play, and then the structured use of play. And free play is an important intellectual, emotional, social skill, but it may not necessarily, we don't know how much of it is absolutely necessary in order for children to learn. In other words, in a 2.5 or 3 hour program, we don't know that free play is an absolute essential. So we need to think very carefully about how we use play. The reason the natural free play is not particularly useful as a teaching tool is that what children play what they already know. If you want them to learn something different, then you got to give them something different to chew on. The second reason why is that children learn things that aren't true from each other and from their own play. And the one example I like the best is the little boy who put the baby in the play oven. And his little play companion said, "Oh, I don't think you ought to put the baby in the oven." And he said, "Put that baby in the oven anyhow." And so his friend said, "Well, don't turn the oven on." And so quickly he turned the oven on. That's nothing we wanted the children to learn. It might be an emotional satisfying, but it was not an activity that is going to teach them about not burning the baby. What should children talk about? Everything. Except burning babies. Don't burn the baby. What else? And this is from the Eager to Learn, and we had the advantage of having Betty Hart on this committee and talked at length about the issue of oral language and how to help children develop better oral language skills. That's the reason one of our first one was that children's knowledge and understanding of language needs to be enhanced. We also need, however, to introduce other forms of representational and symbolic thought. So we do also need to have drawing and early reading or reading preparation. What is it for? How do you use it? What do the letters look like? What are the names of them? What sounds do they make? All of those things are representational thought. And we need to promote their knowledge of the world around them. So I would like to conclude. I went the wrong way. Thank you. Okay. I'd like to conclude with a couple of policy changes that I think we should be advocating for. The first one is a focus on education. That I think child care is a wonderful thing, and we need to pay attention to it, but it's not the same as early education, and we really need to focus on early education and the kinds of things that help children be successful in school. I think we need to desegregate Head Start. It is wrong to have a segregated program for only poor children. It limits the opportunities they have to learn from each other, and I think that we know that children talk like the people they talk with, and it's increasingly difficult if you keep only the same kinds of kids, the kids who use the same kind of language together. You're losing little teachers all over the place. We need to encourage the use of Title I money for preschool programs, which will still keep us in a segregated stance, unfortunately, in most instances, but will give us a better opportunity to have desegregated programs. And finally, I think we need to do better outreach to families. Families need to be helped to do the things they can do. Get the kids to school on time every day. That's something parents can do. Change their vocabulary is much more difficult to ask parents to do. And there is no evidence that if parents give their children permission, they cannot learn new ways of talking in school and maintain their home language at home without any trouble. And this is true whether the children are speaking Spanish or they're speaking Black English. They can learn both things. One language does not impede another language, although dialects are somewhat more difficult than other languages. Thank you.